Hi there, I'm Lillian. Welcome to my channel. Here I help Christian wives heal their femininity so they can stop thinking like sons of God and start embodying their lives like His daughters. I talk about my own journey and how healing my feminine heart led me to the discovery that I was married to a type 3 man. That's the type of man that's a Nabal. If you don't know if you're married to a type 1, 2, or a 3 husband, you can find a link for that in the description box. Do you want to learn how to understand God's Word as a woman, heal yourself by His sanctification, and possibly transform your marriage by faith and knowledge? Then this is the place for you. In this video, I want to give you some tools so that you can answer a fundamental question. Are you following God's truth or the traditions of men when it comes to marriage? By challenging the conventional understanding, I'll be advocating for a marriage dynamic that truly reflects Christ's relationship with the church. I've broken this video into 2 parts. In part 1, I'm going to look at the differences between secular traditions and biblical truths about marriage and how the original teachings have devolved away from God's design. In part 2, I'm going to look at practical examples to clearly contrast these secular traditions with God's principles and His intentions for His daughters in marriage. In the conclusion, I'm going to ask you some questions that will make it more personal for you. Let's begin at the beginning. When I say the traditions of men, I mean man as in secular humanity, the part that's not included in the kingdom. I mean concepts and ideas about marriage that have been handed down from the early church fathers, and with every generation, they've gotten just a little bit further away from the truth. Even though they're called Christian, they might even seem like they are. They never really convey God's intentions towards men and women as His sons and daughters. They're secular mindsets that have been attached to a verse in the Bible and presented like their truth. And even though I refer to them as the traditions of men, I don't mean that men, like males, are bad, or that it's only men, because of all the wrong Christian teaching about marriage that I followed, the most damaging came directly from the ideas and concepts of older women. If I had to pick a date for when true biblical teaching on marriage began to be diluted by the secular traditions of men, it would begin with the Roman Emperor Constantine. In the beginning of Christianity, the apostles and the first believers followed the Jewish calendar, which is based on the moon for their festivals. But more importantly, it's the one that Jesus used as the example to establish His church. But about 300 years after Jesus ascended, Constantine wanted to combine his secular empire with Christianity. So he decided that Christians would use the Roman calendar, which is based on the celebrations of Rome's polytheism. It started out slowly, but the critical change happened during the Council of Nicaea. This was the meeting when the church leaders, our church fathers, decided to celebrate Easter instead of Passover. They changed it to the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. This shift didn't just change the date that God chose to commemorate the freedom from slavery. It completely detached the celebration from God's intended purpose and the significant time marker of His Messiah. The original intention of celebrating Passover was to remind us of our deliverance every year and the power of His plan. That's what's being highlighted in Galatians 4. Over time, Christians leaned more and more into the Roman calendar for all the other holidays, and it gradually became the standard calendar for most Christians around the world. This shift began the divergence of Christians away from the Jewish faith, a faith that Jesus came to graft us into, and instead we began grafting ourselves into the surrounding secular culture. The reason the traditions of men are dangerous to femininity is because it only alludes to the fact that men and women are different. It merely states and restates the obvious. None of the teaching ever reflects on how those differences were intentionally created to interplay with each other in specific ways. The whole of these kinds of teachings about marriage capitalize on the authority structure of marriage and the functions found in the designated roles. In other words, the Christian marriage has become an institution ruled by the authority of the husband and nothing more. The whole marriage is lived out through the stoicism of the roles in the hierarchical structure, just the rules, codes, and functions, without the life and love of God. It's rules without relationship. When it comes to the verses about marriage in the Bible, the traditions of men are what the Talmud is like when it comes to Torah. The Talmud is the oral teaching, but its underpinnings are traditions. It only appears to be anchored in truth, so there's lots of potential for it to go outrageously wrong. In Mark 7, Jesus tells us to be careful about what doctrines we listen to, because human traditions about any particular subject can impact how you receive the knowledge. He says, "How right Isaiah was, for you ignore God's specific orders and you substitute your own traditions. You are simply rejecting God's law and trampling them under your feet for the sake of tradition." That's what's happened with most of the teaching on marriage that's coming from the religious leaders of our time. The truth is being trampled for the sake of tradition, but we believe it's actual truth because it carries a Christian moniker. How do you know that you're listening to systems from the tradition of men rather than actual biblical teaching on marriage? First, by your own personal experience. I knew because it was the same experience over and over again. I knew I had a heart that wanted to change. I knew me. I knew that I would do whatever it took to have a better marriage, even to being willing to assume all of the fault for everything, and constantly looking for the next teaching that would maybe be the solution. 15 years down the road, then 20, then 30. No lasting change for the better, but still, I wouldn't give up. Secondly, the knowledge pool I was drawing all my sources from had to have the name Christian on it. So even though I was desperately looking for change, instead, I ended up just rereading the same information that was being repeated by many different people. The whole marriage is framed as a series of tasks, functions, and obligations to be completed. That's how masculinity operates, not femininity. And it takes two coming together to create the one. A one-flesh relationship isn't about a man turning a woman into a masculine creature like himself. It's a collaboration of both hormones. You need both testosterone and estrogen to create a balanced, healthy, true, fun, authentic, Jesus and the church one-flesh relationship. You'll know you're listening to marriage teaching that comes from the oral traditions of men when there's nothing ever mentioned about what it means to be that feminine creature who's the other component in the one-flesh relationship. There's zero capacity for estrogen's femininity in the marriage. This kind of marriage counsel never talks about how men and women are different from the perspective of testosterone and estrogen. It never teaches about how much masculinity and femininity are pretty much complete opposites, or what all of those huge differences mean to a one-flesh relationship. They never talk about the difference of what it means to have a brain and heart that's soaked in estrogen rather than testosterone. They can't, because the concepts are taught and retaught only from the masculine perspective. They haven't integrated the feminine perspective to their teachings. It's both men and women teaching from the masculine mindset. Men who haven't done the work to understand and accept the femininity of their sisters in Christ, and women so indoctrinated by masculine thinking that they believe their own feelings and emotions are at the very least not to be trusted, and at worst, they're sinful. This divergence isn't just a historical note. It has real, tangible effects on how we live in our marriages today. It's led to a fundamental misunderstanding between doing the roles of marriage and being in a one-flesh relationship. Instead of experiencing the fullness of God's original plan, many wives find themselves trapped in a system that's perpetuating imbalance and deficiency. Now, let's contrast these secular traditions with God's principles that were intended to give life to marriage, not deficiency and death. I want to take us back to the beginning, before Constantine, back to the roots of our faith, our Jewish roots, because that's what Peter's doing when he tells us to emulate the holy women from the past and Sarah. I mean, there's got to be many reasons he specifically set them up as mentors for us. We need to understand how wives can be sincerely following what they think is right guidance, yet the outcome in their marriages doesn't get better, or it ends up worse than what it was before, which is what happened in my case. How does that happen when the heart of you, as a wife, truly wants an authentic and strong marriage? I want us to look at Sarah and Abigail because there's something really interesting here. Both Sarah and Abigail submitted until they didn't. And they were both preserved and even blessed by God. And you know what else is really interesting? Abigail lived in the projection of being equally yoked, but it was Sarah who experienced being equally yoked. As daughters of God, it's important to consider how biblical principles apply to different types of husbands. I'm going to break down 4 marriage concepts that cause the most friction and frustration and confusion. They are submission, respect, a quiet and gentle spirit, and supporting and affirmation. But I'm not just going to arbitrarily break them down. Instead, I'm going to hold them up against 2 archetypes of marriage. I'm going to push those 4 concepts into the marriage of Sarah and Abraham, their archetype 1, and the second archetype is Abigail and Nabal. By using these archetypes, we'll be able to understand how the same marriage concept or idea can be appropriately applied if you're married to an Abraham type, the husband who's wounded and causes a lot of dysfunction in the marriage. But that same marriage concept is extremely inappropriate if you're married to a Nabal type, an evil man who's destructive to the marriage, dangerous to you personally, and harmful to everyone in your household. So without further ado, let's dive into the deep end with submission. Following the interpretation from the traditions of men, that single word plays out like this. You should always submit to your husband's leadership and headship, because that's the position God designed you as a woman to be in. After you get married, you will always be filling the role that's in the inferior position of the hierarchical structure. Your husband has all the authority in the home and the marriage, and you have none. In order for a wife to truly be godly, she must recognize and accept her husband's God-given authority, not just in the home, but over every aspect of her life, because it was Eve who caused the fall of humanity. She's a woman, and so are you. It's godly to support even when you disagree with him. As a believer, you want to align your understanding of marriage with biblical principles, but it's also important to consider the context and the nature of the husband in each marriage. In the context of Sarah and Abraham, her submission to her husband is a beautiful example of a wife honoring her husband's leadership. In Genesis 12, we can see Abraham's obedience to God's call to leave his homeland, and Sarah supported him wholeheartedly. Despite their challenges, Sarah accepted Abraham's authority, which was, and this is key, it was rooted in his obedience and relationship with God. Sarah was able to reflect to Abraham the very submission that he was demonstrating because she witnessed how her husband positioned himself under God's authority, in that inferior position under God. There was no double standard where Abraham said one thing and did another. There was no confusion that made Sarah's submission to Abraham more or less different than Abraham's submission to God. The marriage between Abigail and Nabal present us with the contrast between the first and second archetype. Nabal is described in 1 Samuel 25 as a fool who's an evil man. He was selfish and reckless. These are the traits of a man that's dangerous, not difficult or dysfunctional like Abraham was. Nabal is a dangerous man. He endangered his wife and the whole household. It was Abigail's wisdom and discernment that saved them. Her competence was praised by David and even blessed by God. Here's the thing I wish I'd understood about submission when I first became a believer. Abigail could not submit to Nabal because Nabal did not submit to God. He isn't explicitly described as an atheist in practical terms, but by living in a way that disregards God's presence and influence, he conveys the message to his household that God's authority doesn't matter. By refusing to place himself under the authority of God, Nabal made it impossible for Abigail to offer wifely submission. His unwillingness to place himself underneath God set the foundation and dynamics of the marriage he was supposed to be leading. A husband's submission to God directly influences and enables the wife's submission to himself. In order to submit to the type of husband that's a Nabal, a wife has to deny the reality of the authority structure that God has put in place. Submitting to this kind of husband means you have to lie to yourself about the reality that he's demonstrating for you. For most of my marriage, I chose to ignore this truth, the truth of God's authority structure, and instead, I blindly submitted to a man like this. It demonstrated my naive gullibility, and it led to mental and emotional damage for me, and it did destroy the people in my home. The authority structure and the one-flesh relationship must overlap. It's important to distinguish between the partnership found in the roles of the authority and the relationship. The function of leadership and submission are significant, but they are incredibly incomplete without the relational responsibility of headship and the body factored into the picture. Without this overlap integrated into the marriage, the authority structure becomes a tool that enables irresponsibility, negligence, and sin. In a healthy marriage that reflects Christ and His church, the husband's leadership is characterized by his willingness to place himself in the inferior position under Christ, Ephesians 5:25. Only when a wife witnesses this behavior will she feel safe to submit. And by safe, I mean it's safe for her emotional and mental capacity to adapt to whatever scenario is being placed before her. Applying the advice to submit universally without considering the nature of the husband can lead to problematic situations. For wives married to godly men who genuinely seek to lead their families in obedience to God, submission can foster unity and harmony. But for those married to husbands like Nabal, or on the Nabal-like spectrum, those who are emotionally cold, unloving, and indifferent, with zero regard for God's authority, a different approach is necessary to ensure safety and well-being and peace. The second tradition of men is the advice to always gratify your husband's need to be respected. It sounds like this. It's your biblical responsibility to always treat your husband with genuine honor. It's crucial if you want to have a strong marriage for your husband to experience your respect and that you delight in him, and that you not only just notice him, but that you prefer him and are lovingly concerned with everything about him. And not just that, you should really feel all those feelings as well, and you should be action-oriented about all the feelings. And that means you should demonstrate that you treasure him and revere him through words of affirmation that praise him. Don't ever correct, criticize, or belittle your husband, especially in public, no matter how he's acting, how he's treating you, or speaking to you. When it comes to husbands like Abraham, a wife is enabled to respond with authentic honor and genuine respect and even sexual desire. Abraham's love, care, and godliness, even though he was a broken man who struggled with fear, made it easier for Sarah to honor him. He gave her all the tools to foster a harmonious and strong marriage. This respect is not a command to wives telling them to spontaneously activate respect in a vacuum. It's not a command for wives to act like they respect behavior and characters that are careless or disrespectful. God doesn't need to tell wives this because respect is an organic result. It's cultivated by the husband's demonstration of unconditional love. Respect will definitely strengthen the marriage and build up the husband when it's a natural response to his love. This is the meaning of verse 27 in Ephesians 5, so that he could give her to himself as a glorious church without spot, wrinkle, or any other blemish. But if you're dealing with a Nabal type of husband, the situation is a lot different. According to how he responded to David's men, Nabal was arrogant, self-absorbed, and coarse, a man who did not act in a godly manner. Abigail had to navigate this deeply disturbing marriage with wisdom and discernment. While respect is important, it's necessary to recognize that respecting a husband isn't synonymous with accepting neglect or destructive behavior. There's a way to balance respect with reality. In a healthy marriage, it's important to use words of affirmations, and yes, you want to avoid belittling or criticizing, especially in public. This aligns with Ephesians 4:29, which encourages us to speak only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs. According to their needs. The heart of a husband who's an Abraham type, he knows what his heart needs when he's faced with the truth of who he is. When he's confronted with Abimelech about his lie, he yields to the truth. Nabal did not. When Abigail confronted him, he turned his heart to stone instead of repenting. Nabal would not accept what his heart needed. Abraham did. Both of these women really got what biblical responsibility looks like as a wife. If you're married to an Abraham, often inaction like what Sarah did is required. There's a freedom to respond in vulnerability. But when a husband's behavior is harmful, not just physically, but more importantly, emotionally and mentally, it's necessary to take appropriate actions to ensure safety and well-being. Abigail teaches us that there are times when a wife's got to choose righteous disrespect so that she can protect herself and her household. God honored Abigail's decision and preserved her. Through her life, there's lessons for us here, which is why Peter tells us to learn from these godly women from the past. He's pointing us to her because in some marriages there are circumstances where safety and integrity may require different approaches. The application of the principle of respecting your husband is based solely on your husband's heart and character. And that's why the responses between Sarah and Abigail are so different. For an Abraham type of husband, words of affirmation and avoiding public criticism strengthen the marriage. For a Nabal type of husband, it is important to balance respect with wisdom and seek intervention when necessary. Abigail's example of knowing when to apply righteous disrespect by appealing to the higher authority shows that God preserves wives who act wisely, even if it means taking a different approach. Another tradition of men that isn't truly biblical marriage teaching is what it means to cultivate a gentle and quiet spirit. The unspoken message being conveyed here is that if you're truly a godly wife, your primary goal is to respond with love, care, and gentleness and quietness, especially when your husband is displaying character traits such as being hard-headed, and refusing to give to others, or when he gossips and tries to create division between people, or when he makes fun of people for doing good for others. That it's not your job to correct or criticize him, but instead, it's for you to get stronger by accepting and absorbing it for him. This is fondly told to wives as being long-suffering in marriage. It's important to dig deeply into God's Word, His original words, in order to help understand the true meanings of these virtues, because the traditions of men have reshaped the interpretations over time. I want to break down these two words in a couple of different ways, starting with the misinterpretation of the Greek words and the inadequate and misleading choice of the English ones. First, the traditions of men have interpreted the Greek words pros, which is gentle, and hesios, which is quiet, to mean that it's all about how women talk, using the right inflection and tone and timing and cadence, and talking less rather than more, etc. These words are about a state of mind and the presence of discernment, not what comes out of the mouth. Those of you who've been listening here for a while know that one of the principles for healing that I advocate are to embody the discretion, presence, and grace that come from Proverbs 25, verse 28. Telling wives to talk less and talk right is problematic. These teachings that are from the tradition of men present only half of the concept. That makes it linear and elemental. And not only that, but the masculine headspace involved here is the wrong priority for us women. This is like whenever you talk about a coin, you know there are two sides to every coin, but the head side is always up and the tail side is always down. When you discuss the coin, you only acknowledge the head side, not the tail side, only talking about the head side and neglecting the tail side. Well, the head side is the analytical part. It's the least important part to women when it comes to marriage and relationships. For us, all the depth of our femininity is the side of the coin that's the unseen part. That's the part that's completely ignored because it doesn't get any exposure. It's problematic because females are complex creatures, not single-focused like men. Men start on the outside and work in. We start on the inside and work outwards. Peter knew this about women. What an excellent brother for us he is. That's why he worded 1 Peter 3, verses 3 and 4 the way that he did. He's not saying don't do your hair or nails or makeup. He's not saying don't decorate your body with clothing and jewelry. That's your style. He's saying the priority is your heart, healed and whole the way God intends. Then all the attributes of the outer woman organically and effortlessly become congruent with the inner woman. When the teaching from the traditions of men makes having a quiet and gentle spirit sound like it's something you're supposed to do, like building muscles, then we women internalize that instruction to mean that if you dress modest, it will naturally change and heal your heart. The problem is that these two Greek words are adjectives that characterize a relationship with God. True gentleness and quietness are embodiments. They're results that manifest from an empowered, authentic femininity that possesses deliberate inner calmness and strength and control that are decisively fearless because they're rooted in trusting God, not in your appearance or how you relate to your husband. The second unspoken message is that women should act feminine rather than be feminine. Striving to act feminine removes a woman's power because it's done in the cognitive section of the mind. A woman's power is in her feminine region, the part that houses all her emotions and feelings. It's her heart. When she's up in her head analyzing how to increase the behaviors of gentleness and quietness, she can't access her true authentic power, which is her feelings and emotions. Being quieter or speaking softly, for instance, becomes an act if there's any kind of unresolved conflict in the marriage, or if a woman is in emotional pain from something her husband has done to her. This perspective leads to inauthenticity and the denial of reality. The brain experiences emotional pain and physical pain in the same receptors. So because we are so full of estrogen, we easily detect and abundantly experience negative emotions quicker and more often than men. To tell a wife to be gentler and quieter when she's in emotional pain is equivalent to her husband punching her in the gut and then counseling her that a godly wife will still be gentler with him and quiet. No flinching, no noise. All the while, her brain is receiving signals that she's in physical pain. Not like she's in physical pain. She actually is in physical pain because the brain doesn't differentiate. You have to deny the reality you're experiencing on the inside to act feminine on the outside. Cultivate is an English verb. It indicates active effort. It's a mistranslation to say cultivate a quiet and gentle spirit when praus and hesios are the internal results from the process of becoming. They're part of the sanctification journey through self-awareness of your feminine brokenheartedness. Without revealing where and how you need to heal, it's all just an act of religious piety that's worn like the right clothing. 1 Peter 3, verse 3. Authentic gentleness and quietness come from a healed and whole heart, not from adhering to a prescribed behavior. Next is whether to lean in or not. In the example of the circumstances that Abigail found herself in, when she went to King David to intervene on behalf of her household, you can't say that was quiet and gentle. Not towards Nabal it wasn't. No, she was decisive with wisdom and courage. She leaned away from Nabal and towards King David. Well, future King David. Sarah's relationship with Abraham, her moments of strength and assertiveness, demonstrated her fearlessness, and that's why Peter tells us to examine her. Sarah leaned in towards Abraham. These examples show that being a woman of God is not always about being quiet and gentle in a fake, smarmy sense, but rather about having the discernment and strength and shrewdness to act appropriately in each situation, according to the man you're married to. Finally, you can't become the authentic individual woman God created you to be by merely mimicking what traditions tell you to do. He created his daughters to be everything that his masculine sons are not. That means in a one-flesh relationship, we've got to operate from our true feminine power if we want to honor God's design. He never intended for wives to be the weakest version of their former selves by conforming to some superficial standard of meekness and quietness. Arguing with a man is not a demonstration of feminine strength. True femininity doesn't allow herself to lean into dangerous masculinity. She's repelled by it. The tradition of men tells women to stay in the battle, but to communicate better, to make sure they talk appropriately, to say the right thing at the right time, and in the right way, but don't nag. This confusion crushes femininity rather than empowering it. It's mixed messages that tells a wife to communicate, but to be quiet at the same time. Abigail didn't argue with Nabal. She didn't try and learn a new communication skill to hopefully get through to him this time, because she knew what her husband was like, and she accepted that reality. Instead, she took firm action to protect her family without seeking permission to act quietly and meekly. This inner strength and discernment is what enables a wife to act with feminine wisdom and authenticity, rather than merely following traditional expectations placed on a woman because she gets married. Biblical examples like Abigail and Sarah reveal how true gentleness and quietness are dove-like qualities that emerge from shrewdness, not from suppressing your true self. Okay, number 4 can do a real mind job on your heart. What does it mean for a wife to wholeheartedly support and affirm a husband who's like Nabal versus a husband like Abraham? The only option the traditions of men offer to a wife is that she's to provide an audience for her husband's dreams, concerns, and complaints, and to find out ways to practically assist him in his ambitions, work, responsibilities, and problems, regardless of whether he acknowledges or encourages her dreams or helps with her responsibilities. The implicit message that wives hear is that they are supposed to provide sacrificial love, just like Jesus did. What that means is sacrificing your individuality, and that part of you that's your personal skills and talents, for the sake of your husband's individuality. Even though God specifically sets the example of Jesus being the one that sacrifices for the body, the tradition of men teaches that it's the woman who must provide sacrifice for the man. That's the classic definition of a helpmeet. I want to look at the implications of this advice for wives who are married to a Nabal type of husband versus an Abraham type. It's essential to approach this subject with a clear understanding of biblical principles and how the nature of different husbands can bring 2 different results in the marriage. Wholeheartedly encouraging a husband who's like Nabal can have detrimental effects on a wife's well-being and the overall health of the marriage. Nabal is described in 1 Samuel 25 as cruel and unrestrained. A wife who continually affirms and encourages a husband like that, regardless of his behavior, she's going to enable his destructive tendencies. This can lead to a cycle of neglect, emotional damage, and eventually abuse. The result of blind support can only lead a wife to sacrifice her own well-being, endangering herself and most likely her family. In contrast, supporting a husband like Abraham, the kind of man who visibly works at leading his family in obedience to God, who intangibly contributes to his wife's life, can be a positive and fulfilling experience. Abraham demonstrated love, care, and respect for Sarah, making it easier for her to support his dreams and responsibilities and even protect him. Look at Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 20. How do you get a wife who's so devoted that she'll lie not just once, but twice to protect you? This level of devotion comes from a deep, intrinsic bond where she views her husband as an extension of herself. They're literally embodying a one-flesh relationship. Sarah saw Abraham as part of her own body, recognizing him as her head because he cherished, loved, and supported and invested in her as if she were his own flesh, just like what Paul commands in Ephesians 5, verses 28 and 29. Abraham's affection and commitment resulted in Sarah feeling valued, secure, and strong, and competent. It fostered a profound sense of loyalty and trust. Sarah's devotion to Abraham is a visible witness of the respectful and nurturing way he treated her. This illustrates the powerful dynamic that occurs when a husband truly embodies the sacrificial love Christ has for the church. The advice to shoulder half of his responsibility and sacrifice one's dreams for the husband's, regardless of his behavior, that's a problem. Women having only 10% of the driving force of testosterone compared to men's 90% will completely deplete the pittance she possesses. In order for a woman to use up her 10% driving force on the husband, leaves her with no capacity for herself. This biological difference has to be considered when you're dividing up responsibilities, rather than adhering to a rigid template that doesn't reflect the true nature and difference of each person's individual and unique abilities and contributions. A marriage that only prioritizes the husband's dreams, skills, and talents while disregarding the wife's individuality creates an unbalanced, unhealthy relationship dynamic. It's false teaching when marriage counsel instructs wives to basically take all the gifts and talents the Lord created her with and bury them, Matthew 25, verse 24 through 30, or hide them, Matthew 5, verse 15, which, unfortunately, because of fear and gullibility, that's the route I took. The biblical model of marriage shows that both partners should advocate for and encourage each other's dreams and aspirations. God puts this whole responsibility on the husband to make sure it happens. 1 Peter 3:7. God didn't talk about the concept of the weaker vessel to imply that a woman should sacrifice the little bit of testosterone that they have for the stronger vessel. He instructs husbands to honor their wives by recognizing and appreciating their unique femininity. True interdependence happens when the husband acknowledges and respects and loves the differences between femininity and masculinity. This interdependence involves understanding, supporting, and enjoying their wives rather than exploiting their perceived weaknesses for selfish gain. A godly husband values his wife's contributions to the marriage and cherishes the strength of her femininity for the beneficial impact he knows it has on his masculinity. Abigail's story provides a clear example of a wife who didn't blindly support her husband. Instead, she acted with wisdom and discernment to protect her household and herself. She didn't seek permission to address the situation or try to find a better way to support or communicate with him. Her example shows that there are times when a wife has to demonstrate her competence through independent action for the greater good, rather than blindly supporting destructive behavior. To wrap up, I want to say that a really great starting point to know when you're listening to marriage advice that's rooted in the tradition of men instead of God is by the lack of distinction between the masculinity of a man and the femininity of a woman. All the books that I list in the description section, the books that I tell you to beware of, those are just a few of the books that ignore this singular, vital difference between males and females. Those are the books that drill down on the teaching of the traditions of men. They don't provide expanded comparisons or detailed description that define masculine and feminine traits beyond the scripted roles in marriage. All they say is that biological differences exist, and they're beautiful. But none of these authors talk about what these hormonal differences are or the impact they have on a one-flesh relationship. The other thing I do to distinguish if a marriage concept actually comes from God's heart or if it's rooted in the traditions of men is that I ask these three questions as a kind of sifting mechanism. The first one is, does it support the inception of a woman as the nekeva? I just want to preface that whenever I say Hebrew words or the Greek ones, I really do try and say them right. But sometimes, to tell you the truth, I just give up because my tongue doesn't work that way. But it doesn't change the truth of what the word means. So if you're listening and you do know Hebrew or Greek better than me, thank you for bearing through it. Okay, so that first one again is, does it support the inception of a woman as the nekeva? In Genesis 1:27, the female is inside the body of the male. She's literally a part of his body. God knows she's there, but Adam didn't yet. In Ephesians 5:28, Paul reiterates this truth when he tells husbands, you must love your wife like she's a part of your own body. The next question I ask is, does it support her original state of being as the Ezer Neged? In Genesis 2:18, she's created to be in front of the man, facing, because that's what her name means. In Ephesians 5:33, that's why Paul uses the conjunction hina. It means to respond accurately to what's in front of you. And the third question I ask is, does it support her original design as the Isha? In Genesis 2:22, God makes a point of identifying her as an embodiment of feminine softness. God took out all that pliability and adaptability from inside the man. In essence, he took the majority of his estrogen out of him and used it as the raw material to create a woman, who is created as the opposite of whatever Adam's masculinity is. That's why in 1 Peter 3:7, God makes men completely accountable for the care and protection of that femininity, because it came from inside of them. So for me, in order for a marriage concept to be biblical, it has to hang on all three of these points. In conclusion, you can take a single piece of marriage advice that seems good, yet that same advice could be very dangerous for a wife in situations like Abigail's, where the husband is an immature fool who's bent on abusive behaviors towards everyone. It fails to account for situations where a wife may need to act independently for safety or moral reasons. But when it comes to a relationship like Abraham and Sarah's, where both partners seek to follow God, the advice might be more applicable. At the beginning of the video, I promised you some questions that you could consider to make everything I've said more personal. Here's the first one. How are the differences between masculinity and femininity handled in your marriage? Think about whether your husband understands and acknowledges the unique differences between his masculine qualities and your feminine features. In practical ways, how do these differences play out in your day-to-day interactions? Do you feel seen and cherished, or are there areas where you're faced with neglect, or that you feel invisible? Do you experience safety and the feeling of being valued from your husband's leadership and headship, or do you often feel confused and are driven to seek some kind of clarity? Do you feel the need to self-censor or self-protect? Think about the patterns of conflicts and challenges. Do you rely on the traditional roles from the marriage structure that don't seem to fully address the underlying issues that you experience in your relationship? Do you find yourself trying to appease your husband's moods or tiptoeing around his reactions to avoid conflict? Can you be your real, unfiltered self without provocation? Do the solutions minister to both his masculine qualities and your feminine features? In other words, are the conflict resolutions you experiencing truly honoring to both, or do they just seem to be? How does your understanding of respect influence your relationship with God and yourself? Is the respect you're showing your husband a reflection of the admiration from his genuine, respectable behavior? Or are you being influenced by external teachings that force you to respond in ways that don't line up with who he is and are congruent to your honest feelings? Does your marriage feel like a balanced partnership where both of your dreams and aspirations are supported? Or do you feel like your needs and goals are consistently overlooked, or that they somehow always seem to slip quietly down the priority ladder? If you've listened till the end, thanks for contributing that way. I appreciate you. If you found value in my content, please click the like and subscribe buttons and share it so we can get this message out there. You know my goal here is to help as many wives as I can so that they'll be able to heal and honor God with the femininity that He gifted to them. Bye for now, and I'll see you in the next one.